David Ochabski from Virginia, Maryland, Area Ministry Director. It's going to share on the reliability of the Bible. Is the Bible a reliable guide to truth by John Stewart, a Simon Greenleaf graduate. So take it away, David.
Yeah, so yeah, as Joe said, again, I'm area ministry director of Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, help with national training. That's almost out, the new chapter director training for those who are chapter directors. So, um, I'll just go through this really quickly. He goes through so much material, and he does so. John Stewart, he does so with brevity, and he's pretty clear. I would say this is an introduction to the general reliability of the Bible. Can you guys see my face, by the way? I'm not. I was
Yes.
gonna use a prop really
Yes.
quick. Um, I can't see you guys but Dr. Habermas gives this little thing that he does whenever he's talking about like the resurrection, and methods of history and stuff like that. So he says like a lot of people, especially evangelical Christians, with such a strong emphasis on inerrancy, they always think of like, okay, the Bible, here it is, it's just inerrant, and like that's just how it is. And it's for some of them it's literally impossible for them to think about it as even a historical book. But he says once you're looking at it from the lens of history, like you can just for as a supposition provisionally to just test a theory, you can hold the view of here's the Bible as inerrant, but then there's also here's the Bible as generally reliable. And then he said, for his argument for the resurrection, he says you can hold it even lower and say it's unreliable. But it's got historical nuggets because it is a set of documents from history. And so, in for this booklet, we're arguing, or Stewart is talking about the general reliability. So like the Bible in the middle, he's saying that, some people hold it to be generally unreliable. Dr. Habermas says you don't even need, like you could just argue using the unreliable supposition. So it's important to keep these categories in mind, and to also say, look, I'm not just saying the Bible is not inerrant, but I'm saying it is also historically reliable. In fact, it must be in order for it to be inerrant. Um, with that said, Stewart introduces it saying, the following essay presents facts, evidence, and reasons in support of the reliability of the Bible as a source of truth. The reader is urged to be like a juror in a courtroom trial who considers testimony first, then renders a verdict. The issue for the jury to decide is whether the evidence is sufficient to conclude, indeed, that the Bible is a reliable guide for truth. And notice these words like reliability and evidence. These are confirmational sorts of words, which is to say, dealing with probability, not certainty. So reliability and evidence confirm a theory. So they're dealing with probabilistic matters, and the juror who is trying to find the truth of the matter uses things like abduction, which is a more likelihood probabilistic sort of mode of inference in claiming to know things. It doesn't mean they don't think that the objective events didn't happen, but they're saying here's ways that we can test which event or which description of the event is more accurate. So like I said, he goes over a lot of material. Just a quick outline. He goes first through kind of describing what the Bible is, and what the Old Testament is basically about. So these are more descriptive things, rather than like arguing for the reliability of it. But then in that third section, he goes over, is the Old Testament a reliable guide for truth? And then a very short intermission, he puts the time period between the Old and New Testaments, and then he goes over the New Testament and its reliability, and then he does a summation. So the Bible, he says, First, it's 60 separate writings, and this is more of like background for a person who's just completely unaware of what the Bible is, as a set of documents and how it's different in terms of genres that it covers. And a person who doesn't understand that might take the poetry of the Psalms with exactitude and say, hey, it's a wooden literalism. We need to read it exactly the same way as we do the Gospels. And he would say, no, like the person who doesn't know would be just kind of clueless about that. So he's trying to describe what it is at first. It assumes that God exists and communicates to creation ever since the very first verse. The first three chapters, whoops, typo there, deal with the fall of humanity and implicates sin and separation from God. And the rest of the Bible is God's plan for salvation. So that whole creation, fall, redemption, and restoration model. The Old Testament, these are the subheadings. I honestly just didn't have enough time today to go through each of those subheadings to write little sub bullets, but I wanted to hit on a few main points. So he goes over descriptive stuff, but then he largely dedicates time to how Jesus, as the Messiah, kind of retroactively gives credence to the Old Testament as a whole, because Jesus seemed to give, the same authority with the Ten Commandments and with even things like Jonah and like just as Jonah, was in the belly of the fish for 3 days, so will I. Will be in the underneath the earth and everything like that. He with these statements of authority of the Old Testament, he is basically affirming their historicity and the credence we should have in them. And so what what the author does here is kind of uh, lay everything on whether Jesus rose again. And this is the same point that Dr. Habermas makes in terms of if we can establish that the resurrection happened, then God gave his stamp of approval on everything Jesus said. And one of the things that Jesus said is that the flower doesn't fade and neither does the word, and we can have complete confidence in what has been said in the scriptures. And so it's sort of a pinning a lot more on whether the resurrection happened. And I really like that model. I think that's the quickest way to argue for it. I think it's the quickest way to argue for inerrancy. You can still do general reliability, which he does, but he dedicates just a little bit of time to that. And the main argument that he makes is, we had the Masoretic text, which is kind of a 9th century, 10th century, maybe even 11th century document that every other translation was copied from. And that is clearly way after the events of the Old Testament. But then we came across the Dead Sea Scrolls, and whenever there was a comparison made, and the comparison he makes was with Isaiah, there's virtually no differences apart from stylistic differences and scribal errors that are recognizable, or just change in language, like the way we spell labor versus the way Old English spelled labor, things like that. And there's only one word, I think the word was light, and something about that, where it was omitted in the Masoretic text, but kept in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so, in fact, we've just lost information rather than embellished information or, done anything with that. So, because of the continuity of and the consistency of copyist practices that the Jews used, we can have confidence in the reliability of the transmission of the words. And the Jews did it better than anybody else in history. There's no comparison between what was written, starting in the 450 BC to potentially 11th century AD, and having virtually no difference in texts when it comes to substantive matters. That's incredible. So that's basically the argument he gives for the Old Testament reliability. oh yeah, so I kind of just went over that. So you can look at that if you want. For the New Testament, he gives a few different arguments, all basically saying that first of all, that archaeologically, the events that were purported in the New Testament matched the linguistic conventions of the time. So what I mean by that is, like, for example, Luke in Acts would give, positions of political figures and names of cities and the names of people and the conventions that were used back then. He would give with precision, and he'd use the technical titles, even titles that weren't thought to be used until we found later archaeological discoveries that gave those same exact titles to those political figures, for example. So in terms of archaeology, we only find corroboration. And then in terms of transmission, the argument he gives is in terms of the quantity of manuscript evidence that we have. So he worded it a little weird. It kind of sounds like he was saying that we have 20,000 Greek manuscripts, but if you read the full sentence, he says, and other languages. So I would make that footnote really quick, and say we have about 6,000. It's hard to count based, but for studies that have been done, there's about 6,000 or 6,500 Greek manuscripts, and most of those occur between the 3rd and 8th century. We have about 40 Greek manuscripts, also hard to count and how to in terms of how to date, but between the 1st and 3rd century. But all of those provide, if you read through, very reliable transmission of um, the autographs. So the autographs are the original manuscripts. So those are kind of the arguments he makes for the New Testament as a reliable guide to truth. In terms of the wording that he uses for a reliable guide to truth, I thought it was important to kind of make a distinction, and this is all me, this isn't what was in the booklet, but between uh, the the accuracy of the description of the events. So the autographs, how accurately the autographs represented what really happened back in that time, and then the transmission of those autographs, because you can have the autograph saying, whatever was the case and become 100% accurate, but then you also have to argue secondarily for the continuity of that message being transmitted in throughout copies. So he doesn't make that point as explicit, and I think it's important to make that point explicit, because then people get lost in the methods of history and why it matters so much to do textual criticism and things like that. So it kind of gives them a context. But that's generally the he goes into random things like lost gospels. Um, I think he calls it, like, it's like grape nuts. It's neither grape nor nuts. They're neither lost nor gospels. We have them, so they're not lost, and then they're clearly not gospels. And the people back then knew about them at the time. There's references to them, and they didn't count them, so they're not gospels. So things like that. He goes into random things to establish the reliability, but you guys can look through that yourself. Um, and that's it. Any comments, question?
Great presentation, great slides as usual. And I think what you said about his comment at the bottom, page 16, on 20,000 Greek manuscripts and versions of the New Testament is a good clarifying point. One of the things I kind of appreciated about the booklet was the last couple of pages where he talked about some of the not Christian sources for the life of Christ. And it's all very introductory. I mean,
Yeah, and
but
that's another point I would make really quickly is like that's really cool to see, especially a person who doesn't read a lot of history like myself. I'm not a history buff or anything like that. When I first saw like how many people from various backgrounds all corroborated the testimony of the Gospels, Josephus and Tacitus and Pliny and everyone else. Um, it's really cool to see that. But at the same time, I would say prefatory, those aren't even the best evidence. It's the best documents are the Gospels. So it's like that's helpful to just kind of like point back within history. But if you're actually talking about the most reliable things for that first premise of establishing that these are accurate descriptions of these actual historical events, you want the Gospels. You don't want these secondary documents.
or even if you want the oldest, you could go to First Corinthians, right?
Right. Yeah.
You go
And they're
back
the earliest documents too.
again. Other people want to comment or ask Dave a question?
Yeah, and just a comment. So before I became a believer, this general area of question was my main question about the preservation of the Bible. So, I mean, my personal story is like I grew up a theist from a very young age, and I was convinced there was a God. And at the time I became a believer, I mean, I know Gary Habermas was around, but I didn't know anything about his minimal facts argument to support the resurrection. So I came at it from a different angle. Is the Bible a reliable source of truth and of history? That's the general question. And if I could satisfy myself with that question, then I could accept Jesus Christ, the resurrection, and then that path. And of course, now, I mean, I have a different way to understand that through Habermas's scholarship and other ways of arriving at that conclusion. But it's still a valid topic. We had a very big, well-produced debate with Mike Licona and Bart Ehrman came to Kennesaw State University and had packed out house there and a lot of Ehrman fans are out there. There's still a lot of people who think about these questions, and they still have questions, even when you stack up the numbers. So the discussion's far from closed for many people, especially if they study in this area. And I think it's certainly, it does fill a topic that I think, at least for the apologists, we have to have some level of ability to talk to this topic.
Just really briefly, because we're getting late, being a lifelong investigator, and my dissertation work was on evidence. Just to say that the Gospels have all the forms of evidence and accepted principles that you use in the criminal justice system today, to include historical direct evidence, indirect evidence, corroboration, even hearsay evidence, which isn't the strongest evidence, but it still can be admissible. So just to say that, like David said, that the Gospels are the greatest evidence because they satisfy all the forms of evidence that there are.
Yeah, and I want to say Stewart also makes that point of like not all of those points as Ross did, but the observable evidence he calls it. I would say empirical, and some of the greats like John Warwick Montgomery and others have said that explicitly. Like we're talking about empirical evidence here. Like they are saying this was something that they saw, and yeah.